hell are you looking at?
What? Like you've seen me do this before? That's right, I'm back. Now, you're probably asking yourself, where the hell have you been for almost a year and a half? Well, that's a long story. Let's just cut it short and say I was too busy with time in my hands and I thought I was going to end this. But, looks like I had to come back. Because you all missed me so much. And guess what? It's 2014. Let's talk about video games.
Now, I know what you all are saying. Isn't there a guy out there that already does this for us? Yes, and he hasn't been doing a really good job of that, but then again, who am I to judge? It seems that people nowadays are talking more and more about video games, over either the graphics, the console design, console look, how it plays, but they never go over the one key factor that I feel should be addressed. How the controller looks, how the controller feels, how the controller actually responds. So today, we're going to be giving praise to the controller. Some of the earliest gaming controllers actually came out in the late 50s, early 60s. Yeah, when the first video game came out, many of these consoles and their controllers were computers with switches, knobs, and buttons. And this would be the style for at least the next 20 years of gaming. It wouldn't be until the late 70s when a little company called Atari would make a big innovation. And what was that innovation?
This is the Atari 2600 controller. And the Atari 2600 came out in 1977. So, before this, there was knobs, switches, and buttons. This made innovation. The joystick. Yeah, there was a button on it, but to be all honest, the joystick is really where it matters. And many people nowadays claim that this is the representation of a great gaming controller. My opinion? I actually somewhat agree. Yeah, it's kind of funny thinking that for this being now the representation of what gaming is, I can somewhat see that as this was what launched the big video game market. Predating this, there was the Magnavox, and that did successful, but it was limited to only the Magnavox television sets. The Atari you could play anywhere. And again, not much to it, just a joystick and a button, and it works pretty well as many of the games involve just a joystick and a button. There have been innovations where they did wireless controllers, and they had some where they had to get specialty made double controllers, but those didn't really work and many people just stuck to using this. But that's just it, the Atari 2600.
After the success of the 2600, Mattel and Coleco were next in line to dip their toe in the video game market. Mattel in 1980 released the Intellivision, which was kind of a clunky console. Its controller, on the other hand, was kind of weird. It was a phone-like design with fire buttons on the side and a ring pad in the middle. Some people jammed their thumbs hitting that pad. Coleco, which released their system in 1982, their console was great. It released Donkey Kong, and the controller was sort of in the same way as Intellivision. While they didn't use the ring pad, they did a joystick, and it's kind of awkward to move around with. In 1982, Atari decided to go into the next generation of gaming by releasing the 5200. Unfortunately, the system was a flop, and its controller wasn't any helpful either. Unfortunately, the controller was unresponsive,
And like the Intellivision ColecoVision, it carried the phone-like design, which kind of didn't make sense. But it did introduce us to the pause button, which that was a great gaming innovation. Unfortunately, gaming innovations would have had been put aside as the video game crash in 1983 occurred, and no new consoles were being developed, well, at least here in America, between the years 83 to 85. Many causes were likely due to this, many of them being poorly made games, an abundance of consoles, and many companies lost money. Mattel got out of the gaming division altogether, Coleco got out of the gaming division altogether, and Atari just got sold off to everyone. But it wouldn't be until 1985 when a certain Japanese company would show up and re-revolutionize gaming for an entire new generation.
The Nintendo Entertainment System. This console revitalized gaming in 1985 when it was released, giving us hits like the Mario Brothers trilogy, Dr. Mario, Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, Metroid, and Mega Man. Another thing this console did was give us an extraordinary controller, which in my opinion is one of my personal favorites. The original NES controller. This controller used a D-pad instead of a joystick. The D-pad, by the way, was introduced with the Game & Watch in 1980, and that was the first time it gave players a chance to play the games, again without using a joystick or even using buttons to move around. This made gamers feel more comfortable with their controllers. With a simple design, even the earliest of the most casual gamers could pick this up and play it. Over the years, Nintendo would expand upon their controllers with some alternates. Like, for example, the NES Max, which was the first to feature turbo buttons, and was actually meant for gamers who enjoyed sports games like ice hockey, especially with the circle D-pad. Then there was the NES Advantage, which was for the arcade-like gamers who enjoyed playing hits like Pac-Man and Donkey Kong, and this was the only NES controller, in my opinion, to use a joystick. This also came along with the turbo buttons as well. There was also the NES Zapper, which came out along with the original controller, and this used light ray technology, in which when you shot the gun, it would give off a fraction of a second light, which would beam and determine whether or not you hit the target. In 1992, Nintendo decided to redesign and re-release the NES with a new controller, in what we now know as the dog bone design. This controller is actually one of my personal favorites, as it comes out of one of my properly favorite game systems. After the success of the NES, many gaming companies started to realize that video games were becoming popular again. I would say starting with the Atari, they released the 7800, which they have actually had shelves since 1984. Does the console hold up? No. Its controller? While it looks somewhat like an NES controller, there's a few minor bug issues. I would say this mostly with the way you have to move around. While it's nice that they tried to involve a D-pad into this, the addition of the joystick on top of that makes it kind of like they weren't ready to move on. Well, it's not much of a problem, it's more of a concern. And they tried to fix this with a new controller, but that controller really didn't help out as well either. Meanwhile, another Japanese company decided to make a game console and sent it overseas. The company's name was Sega, and their system was the Master System. Now, what can be said about the system is that while it didn't have a great library of games, it had some of the greatest graphics. About their controller, it's a piece of pop culture history to think about it. I mean, if you watch regular show, look at their controllers, what are they obviously going to be playing? A great controller for a great system. After the semi-success of the Mega Drive, Sega decided to release their next console overseas, the Genesis. Well, at first the Genesis didn't really sell. They decided to go for brilliant marketing strategy, getting famous names. This would happen until 1991, when Sonic the Hedgehog would appear. But we're not here to talk about the console, we're here to talk about the controller, as I remembered. The controller is another classic. It goes along the lines of the Atari and NES. It'll forever be cemented in pop culture. I have really nothing else to discuss with this controller. It's just perfect in every way. With Atari, on the other hand, I'm not going to discuss it. Bottom line, Jaguar sucks, the controller sucks, Atari just fell flat down after this.
In 1991, Nintendo would try to combat Sega with the SNES. Now, this controller has also reached pop culture fame, and I actually find it, again, pretty good. We got our D-pad, as usual, start and select, and for an innovation this time, we have X, Y, and bumpers, L and R. There's like nothing else I could talk about with this. There actually has been that many modifications, and the one I'm actually holding here is from Tomy. So, really that's all I have to say about the SNES controller.
After releasing a bunch of add-ons for the Sega Genesis, Sega decided to then release the Sega Saturn. This console is underappreciated, as I feel. On top of that, the controller is basically a 6-button Sega Genesis controller. There was an alternate called a 3D pad, but it's again a 6-button Sega Genesis controller just as a circle. After a planned partnership with Nintendo fell out and left Sony in the dust, Sony decided to rebel back by releasing the PlayStation. The PlayStation became an immense success in the mid-90s, and with that, it had an immensely successful controller. This controller did something that Nintendo didn't. It had analog control sticks, your usual D-pad, LR bumpers as usual, but it had 2 of those. It also had, instead of A, B, X, and Y, it had square, X, circle, and triangle. It also had select start and a button to choose option for analog sticks. I find this controller at first really interesting, but after so many years of having it, you start to wonder if they ever actually modified it. Yeah, I know nowadays with the PS4 there is now the touchpad, but that doesn't really add much to it in my opinion. It just makes it a same console with just the middle section cut out. Revolutionized. To compete with the PlayStation in 1997, Nintendo released the N64. The N64 became a great console for many gamers. While many of them disapproved of the cartridge idea, which still haunts Nintendo to this day, well, many of us actually can agree, that the N64 had probably one of the greatest controllers made. I mean, with the M shape, the analog stick, your D-pad, start, select, this acquired a new feature with the C buttons. While it still had L and R, it also, interestingly enough, innovated with a Z trigger. This was more meant for shooting games like GoldenEye. In 2000, a Japanese company called Hori would make a new version of the N64 controller, called the N64 Mini. In my opinion, this is probably one of my favorite of the N64 controllers. It's small, more easy to use, and while it's not meant for big-handed people, you can slowly get used to it, and it's just well adapted. In 1999, Sega released their final console called the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast, in my opinion, is a perfect console. Does it hold up to the NES in game quality? Actually, yes. Its controller is actually pretty awesome as well. It's actually one of my favorites that I've seen. It actually looks like a rocket. And in a way, it was kind of interesting as it also included a separate mini little game system within it that you could take out and play. So, I give it props for that. In 2001, Nintendo finally released their first disc-based system called the GameCube. The GameCube is a sort of underrated console, and in my opinion, I actually find it one of my favorites. The GameCube's controller, on the other hand, is also wonderful. Looking at it, you got your analog stick as usual, your D-pad down here, which upsets some people, but I learned to forget about it. Your C-stick, which I find really useful for many games. L and R bumpers up here, and Z trigger over here. Y, X, A, and B over there. And again, start. So, why do many people not really remember the GameCube? I think one of the reasons is because Nintendo took a step in the right direction, but they didn't take a step in the truly right direction. But it's not really my opinion. In my opinion, they took a step in the right direction. It may not have been a big leap, but give them credit that they actually upgraded. And this controller, it's one of those big upgrades. In 2000, Mori would again make another controller for another Nintendo. This time for the GameCube, they redid the GameCube controller and made it look more like an SNES controller, which, when I said the Dreamcast was one of my favorites, this is another one of my favorites too. It actually, again, gives it that retro nostalgic feel, and I appreciate it for doing that good of a job, making us all feel nostalgic for an SNES controller. In 2003, Microsoft would enter the gaming market with the Xbox, and I find the Xbox a little overrated, in my opinion. Not saying it's a bad system, which it's not, it's just, it's overhyped. But with that aside, let's talk about, again, the controller. Believe me, I've tried to hold one of these things, it doesn't work for me. I can't hold it. I've tried and I've tried, but I still can't. In 2006, Nintendo would finally release a full disc operating console with the Wii. Now, many people have criticized the Wii, calling it shameless and really just not for hardcore gamers and kiddie-ish. It's okay in that way. I actually find it better. I think it's more calm, relaxed, and again, more meant for casual people. The controller is no doubt the same way. Again, you got your D-pad, A, plus and minus, which I guess are replacements for select and start. A new feature, which is the home button, which will take you to the home menu of the Wii, and 1 and 2, which if you turn it sideways is the perfect supplement for an A and B on an NES, but that's if you got a Wii Virtual Console. Other than that, I'd find it more as an X and Y. The B button's on the back, sort of like a trigger, and while I find this good, it's sometimes distracting, especially when you're holding something or you put it down and it smacks against the table. Other than that, I don't think there's been many variations. I've seen people with Wii controllers that were see-through, and I've seen those at Walmart, but I really don't want to discuss much more about it. I'm going to just say, for the record, the Wii is a good system. Stop bashing it. It's good. The Wii U, on the other hand, that's also a good system. I'm actually not complaining. I played it. I don't have a controller with me. I don't have a picture. I apologize. That's just it. Both of these controllers are good. I find them good. End of story.
What are you looking at? It's over. Go home. Get a life. Leave me alone. Leave me be. I mean, sheesh.